Hello everyone and welcome to Path to the Playoff, presented by Academy Sports and Outdoors. For all, for less. My name is Brandon Adams. This is the former Alabama All-American Mike Johnson, and for the next few minutes, we're going to take a look at what we think the College Football Playoff Selection Committee is going to do when it releases its announcements a little later on tonight. We'll talk about some risers and some fallers there for that. We'll also, as the top 25 is announced tonight, we will give that to you here live on the air as well. You'll see that coming up on tonight's show. We'll also preview the Iron Bowl a little later on tonight. That battle that's in a lot of ways almost like a national quarterfinal game as it puts a team towards the SEC championship beyond. And then speaking of the SEC championship, we'll finish off our show tonight by also talking a little bit about the one team that's already in the game next Saturday, the Georgia Bulldogs, who they may want to play and who they will play. Obviously, the winner of that Iron Bowl as it unfolds here on Saturday.
Yeah, we talk about path to the playoffs, and it starts this weekend. When you talk about some of the matchups, a lot of these teams are going to have a lot of big road games, a lot of double-digit spreads, but a lot of tough games when you talk about some of these teams going on the road. Alabama at Auburn, some other ones out there. I think it's going to be an interesting weekend.
And I think for a lot of the SEC fans, we're going to take your comments here today on our Path to Playoff show presented by Academy Sports and Outdoors. But I think there are a lot of SEC fans, whether you root for one of the teams that's involved in the game on Saturday or not, or throughout the weekend, just some excitement and some energy about having some big games. You know, last week was almost like a placeholder Saturday. You had Alabama playing Mercer. You had Auburn playing Louisiana Monroe. Georgia played Kentucky, but it already wrapped up the East. It was almost like one of those just let's fast forward through this week and get ready for obviously what's going to unfold here this weekend.
Yeah, when you look down the list of the top 10 teams and what the records you saw from this past weekend, I think you look at obviously Miami, a tight game against Virginia, Notre Dame, a tight game against Navy, but other than that, a lot of lopsided scores. You look at Alabama, you look at Clemson, you look at Auburn. A lot of these teams played nobody schools and ended up having huge lopsided victories.
So, and obviously the Alabama Crimson Tide getting ready to take on Auburn on Saturday. You know, one of the things that Nick Saban talked about this week was that he actually accomplished, I think, what his goals were for that game. You know, he said he wanted to sort of maintain a high standard. Yep. You know, the same level of focus and intensity that Alabama has shown in all of its games. He wanted to see that in the game against Mercer, setting the stage for Auburn. And I think that Saban, based on some of what he said this week, I think he sort of got what he wanted there.
He definitely did. I know he wanted to get a lot more playing time for Dylan Moses at the linebacker position. He also wanted to escape the game without injury. I think that's the biggest thing when you talk about some of these Week 12 matchups against the Mercers and the ULMs of the world. Get out without getting banged up. That's especially big for Alabama at this point in the season as they face the injuries from the linebacking core. They were able to accomplish a lot of that. They looked pristine in the passing game. Jalen Hurts finished 7 of 7 on the day. Dylan Moses had 11 tackles, and I think they a little bit ahead of steam going to the Iron Bowl.
Chris Wood says roll tide, and obviously Alabama expects to be number one when the College Football Playoff rankings are re-released in a couple of minutes. We'll bring those to you as they happen tonight on our Path to Playoff show presented by Academy Sports and Outdoors. But let's talk about some of the other movement that we expect to see in the top 25 tonight. Right. Probably not a lot, but I do think there are a few teams that could be rising up. Even if the ranking doesn't change all that much, I think there's a chance that the perception of these teams is starting to change a little bit. Let me start with a couple teams from the Big Ten here, and specifically I want to start with the Wisconsin Badgers. And I know how a lot of SEC fans feel about the state of the Big Ten, Wisconsin in particular, a program that probably hasn't had a great season, a lot of dominant wins, but it did get a big win on Saturday against a ranked Michigan team and a high-profile Wolverines team led by obviously a celebrity coach like Jim Harbaugh. I think that Wisconsin, whether it's reflected in tonight's rankings or not, I do think that's a team kind of on the rise here, just given the fact that they are clearly earning some respect by beating a ranked opponent last Saturday.
Yeah, I agree. And listen, when you look at that game and you look at it a lot closer, probably a lot closer than it came out on the scoreboard. 24-10, they were able to beat Michigan. But when you look at Michigan, the fact that their quarterback goes out with a head injury, had another couple of nicked up players during the game. Wisconsin, in terms of the way they play, I don't think they did themselves any favors to kind of look at the record and say, man, we're being dominant. They just weren't that dominant in this game this past weekend, and still a lot of questions out on the national landscape about what they are.
Another team that I believe that's rising up here tonight, whether it's reflecting the polls or not, is Ohio State. And please don't shoot the messenger here on this, because I know there's a lot of Ohio State fatigue here around SEC country, because maybe Ohio State's gotten the benefit of the doubt from the committee twice in the 3-year history of the College Football Playoff. But this two-loss Ohio State team, I believe, by virtue of what it's done since it lost to Iowa, has put itself in a position where it's a win out and you're in type of thing. Beat your big rival Michigan to close out the regular season, win the Big Ten championship against Wisconsin, a game the Buckeyes are going to be favored in. And as much as a lot of SEC fans may not like it, I think the two-loss Ohio State team makes the college football playoff. I think to a certain extent they control their own fate in terms of making it into the postseason.
Yeah, there's going to be a lot of uprising when you talk about the people that hate the brand names that get in. When you look at an Ohio State team that loses to Oklahoma, a pretty good team in their own right, and then loses to Iowa. I mean, kind of a head scratcher, but you continue to see Ohio State pile up these blowout victories against lesser teams, 52-14 this past weekend, and they are building momentum. I think JT Parrott's playing at a high level. Obviously, he's one of the better quarterbacks in Ohio State history, and when you put them into the playoff, they're going to have to deserve the spot there. I know it's going to be tough for the committee to look at last year and not think about Ohio State's performance in that game against Clemson last year. 31-0, Ohio State got beat and knocked out of that game. So you're going to have to kind of look past some things if Ohio State's going to slide in. But I'm with you. I think there's definitely a path for it.
Let me give you one more team I think it's on the rise tonight, and I do think this will be reflected in their ranking. I believe LSU ranked number 20 from last week. I believe they're going to be ranked higher than that this week. And listen, we talk a lot about LSU in our program each and every day here on SEC Country, and I think that we're in a situation here where LSU going on the road last week, torrential downpour in Knoxville, Tennessee. Yes, Tennessee, has fired its coach Butch Jones. Yep. They don't have much to play for, but I thought that LSU showed a lot of focus in that game last week, and I think that LSU has done a great job of making folks forget about the Troy loss early in the season, and LSU's in a position right now where it's actually on its way to finishing the season on a pretty strong note here, and I think it's going to be reflected by the College Football Playoff Selection Committee tonight.
I completely agree with you. If I'm anybody that's going to be able to line up with LSU in this bowl game, I'm not excited about it. LSU has a physical style at the end of the year, and they were able to impose their will on Tennessee. You talk about the rainstorm, you talk about the spread or whether or not LSU could go in there and get it done. I thought they did a great job. Hats off to Ed Orgeron and company down there in Baton Rouge. I think that they're definitely a team on the rise. I don't think anybody wants to match up against LSU at this point in the season. They're going to be a 10.5-point favorite against a decent Texas A&M team this week.
In the comments section, Ronnie in the comment section says, please no Ohio State in the college football playoff. That was one of the teams we suggested could be risers a moment ago. And what Ronnie says there in the comment section is so, I think, well reflective of how a lot of SEC fans feel, that there is this rivalry that goes on between the Big Ten and the SEC. Ohio State in particular, a lot of SEC fans don't like Urban Meyer, and there is this thought of Ohio State climbing. Well, here we go again with the committee rewarding the same team we've seen them reward in the past.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting, too, to see the fallout, because what you're going to have, if everything stays equal, obviously there's a couple teams that are going to go into some of the matchups this weekend. Some people in the top 10 are going to lose. That's just the nature of the beast, especially when you look at the road games. When you look at Alabama, Auburn, and Georgia, possibly one of those teams get in. You look at a Clemson and Miami, possibly one of those teams get in. And you have to include Wisconsin and Ohio State as kind of that semifinal type game that you're going to see in a couple weeks.
Dave Wallace in the comment section says, an undefeated UCF, by the way, led by Scott Frost, one of those coaching candidates potentially mentioned for some SEC jobs. He says they ought to be in over a two-loss Ohio State team. The truth is, even if Ohio State's got two losses, they're still better than UCF, I believe. Yep. They're certainly a more talented team. And so while I understand the idea of having the zero in the loss column, Ohio State's still the better of the team.
Listen, UCF's been great. They handled Temple really well this past weekend, 45-19. By the way, they're playing a very good South Florida team this weekend. They're going to have to deal with Quentin Flowers and South Florida and company, a team that's been able to make a lot of noise on the national landscape the last couple of years. So they need to focus on that game first. But I'm with you. There's too much talent at some of these teams at the top. When you look at the teams really 1 through 10, I think I'd have all of them favored over UCF.
So if they're going to be risers, there've got to be some fallers as well. I think there will be some in the committee tonight. A lot of these based on losses from last week. In one case, though, maybe not. Let me start with Oklahoma State here, who obviously drops the game on Saturday. And I think one of the problems for Oklahoma, a team that we expect to potentially be in the college football playoff, is that Oklahoma State here late in the season, maybe not carrying the flag as well for the Big 12 as maybe folks in that part of the country would like. I mean, conferences are judged side by side, and to a certain degree, the Big 12 comes up lacking in some of these comparisons.
Yeah, that's kind of the story of Mike Gundy's tenure so far at Oklahoma State. Some of the games that they should win by a wide margin, they're not able to do it. It was 45-40 to a Kansas State team that, by the way, do you remember this? Lost to Vanderbilt early on in the year. It's not Bill Snyder's best team at Kansas State, and Oklahoma State just can't get it done. They're going to be a 41-point favorite this weekend against Kansas. They should be able to take that handily. But when you talk about the three losses, you're right. I don't think they've been the torchbearers that you kind of expected the Big 12 to have. I think a lot of people, when you looked at the Big 12 championship game, thought maybe Oklahoma State rematch. It's just not going to be the case this year.
We'll be able to give you some of the committee rankings here in just a moment as they come in on our Path to the Playoff show presented by Academy Sports and Outdoors. Let me talk here for a moment, though, about one of those teams that, believe it or not, I think could be in a more vulnerable position tonight. That's Mississippi State. Mississippi State held at number 16 last week after losing to Alabama. This week maybe a little closer than it should have been against Arkansas. Is this a team that the committee takes a second look at, and maybe a negative look, given the fact that they've been at 16 essentially since the first rankings came out on the 31st, and maybe last Saturday didn't exactly play like that kind of team?
They're such a head scratcher. This is one of my issues with Dan Mullen when some of these big jobs come up. Is that you beat UMass by a touchdown, and then you lose to Bama by a touchdown, and then you need to score 14 points in the fourth quarter to beat a bad Arkansas team. And so 28-21, obviously heading into a huge Egg Bowl this weekend against Ole Miss, but it's a head scratcher. Why can't you play more consistently at Mississippi State right now? They're a very good team. They've got a very good offensive line. They've got a good quarterback, good running game. I don't think this game should have been this close, and so maybe there is a chance that they get docked a little bit in this ranking.
Seeing a lot of Alabama and Auburn fans making some noise in the comment section. We'll look forward to taking your comments tonight. Let me talk to you about one more team who I think falls in the rankings tonight by virtue of the loss to Wake Forest last Saturday, and this doesn't impact North Carolina State, the team that I do believe is falling, but NC State's one of those high-profile wins for some of these ACC teams here, and all of a sudden NC State here late in the season, maybe not quite the marquee victory appeared earlier in the year as these losses start to pile up for the Wolfpack.
Yeah, when you look at Notre Dame, when you look at Clemson, that was a win that looked really good on their schedule. Now NC State continues to fall, and they're another team that you can't really figure out. I mean, they put up great fights against teams that are really good, and then they turn around, and it's not that Wake Forest isn't very good. I think Wake Forest is better than a lot of people imagine they are, but just not able to get it done. 30-14, not even really a close game when you look at Wake Forest matchup. And when you look at the dominant defensive line for NC State, you thought that maybe they'd carry them a little bit farther this year, but they're a team that really has ping-ponged in and out of this top 25 bracket since we started doing the show.
A lot of comments coming in. Frederick Peters in the comment section talking about Auburn going down. That was the number 6 team in the country last week. My guess is that's where they will be again today. We'll give you these rankings as they start to come out from the College Football Playoff Selection Committee in just a moment. But when you hear these comments, like folks like Frederick Peterson, you really get the sense of just how much of a fever pitch and a passion that's building for the Iron Bowl on Saturday. Not just because these two teams dislike each other so much, but also because of what's at stake. Our Path to Playoff presented by Academy Sports and Outdoors. The road to that college football playoff clearly goes through Jordan-Hare Stadium on Saturday.
It definitely does, and it has for the last couple of weeks when you talk about Georgia going in there and then Auburn having to battle their way back into it. And I think this has been enveloped really well when some of these coaches talk about, it's semifinal, quarterfinal almost when you talk about this weekend. You have to get through this game. And we're going to talk later about maybe, if Alabama loses this game, is there still a path? There's not one for Auburn. So this is a must-win game in a lot of ways for both these teams. Obviously, this is always a game that has a ton of passion to it, but when you add in these rankings, at least for the last 8 or 9 years, I think both these teams, either one of them, have been ranked inside the top 2 when they faced off for the last 8 or 9 years, dating back to when Nick Saban got there. Just an incredible matchup, and I think the teams are really evenly matched.
Johnny Terry in the comment section also mentioned one of the reasons why Mississippi State maybe didn't look as strong against Arkansas last Saturday is because of the emotion it spent in the game in its own stadium, which was rocking for Alabama 2 Saturdays ago. And I think that's largely true. I think that Mississippi State probably played above its head as close as it could have against Alabama. Really came within an eyelash of winning that game and changing the playoff prognosis for Alabama in a big way, but maybe left something on the field there in Starkville that it wasn't able to take to Fayetteville this past Saturday.
Yeah, and that's a bruising game too. I mean, this is not a Mississippi State team that's going to line up and finesse you to death. This is a team in Nick Fitzgerald and company that are going to come right at you offensively, and that's what they did. They went for the time of possession. I think they had 38 minutes time of possession, are able to march down the field a lot of times in Alabama's defense, but Mississippi State's defense couldn't get it done. Alabama able to kind of expose them a couple weeks ago and put up 31 in 21 minutes. So it was a very, very physical game, and I'm not surprised, I guess, in a lot of ways that you saw the outcome this past weekend.
If you're just joining us, that is Mike Johnson, the former Alabama All-American. My name is Brandon Adams. This is Path to the Playoff, presented by Academy Sports and Outdoors. Academy Sports and Outdoors, for all, for less. In just a couple of minutes, we'll be able to release to you the latest College Football Playoff Selection Committee rankings as they come out. We'll interact with you about those in our comment section all throughout the evening here, so make sure you stick it where you got it. We'll continue to talk to you on the SEC Country Facebook page. Couple comments coming in, and I think this is a really interesting question. Let me scroll down here so I can get this one. Jake Lucas says, just jumping into the broadcast, any chance that South Carolina pulls the upset on Clemson and Williams-Brice Stadium this Saturday? We're going to talk about that rivalry game later on the show because Clemson, who was ranked number 2 by the committee last week and sort of quietly going into its rivalry game to end the season with its in-state rival out of conference, South Carolina. I do think there's a chance that South Carolina does play closer with Clemson. Do they win the game outright? I don't know. But do they play close enough, long enough to put a scare in the Tigers and have folks rethinking that comparison between Clemson and Miami coming to the ACC? I could see Will Muschamp's team doing that on Saturday.
I 100% can do it. And by the way, this is going to be a crazy, raucous environment in William Bryce Stadium this weekend. South Carolina is only a 14-point underdog. And when you really kind of look at that and think about how the game played out last year, when really Jake Bentley got removed and they made no bones about it, it was almost about his health at that point. The way Clemson's defense was attacking that quarterback position, attacking that offense, very lopsided victory for Clemson last year. I would not be shocked. I'm with you. Would not be shocked if there's a very tight game entering the fourth quarter. And maybe South Carolina pulls some plays with Jake Bentley to be able to get this thing really tight at the end.
Dave Wallace asks, if Clemson loses to South Carolina but wins the ACC championship, does the ACC champion then make the college football playoff? And you can tell me, maybe you disagree, but I think even with the loss, the ACC champion would still be in a pretty good spot because right now we're actually in a situation, if there are upsets in the final week of the regular season, that we actually have a hard time finding four, more so than we have too many teams to squeeze into the top four. We could be in a situation where, maybe Clemson's not the only team to get upset there, and all of a sudden the game that we think is a play-in for the ACC, much like the SEC and possibly the Big Ten, maybe it still holds out that way because you just don't have four other legitimate teams. Really, no one else in the Big 12 right now, I believe, except for Oklahoma. The Pac-12 may be released there from that conversation as well.
It would be interesting. I mean, there's a ton of different ways for this thing to come about, but you talk about who you might be comparing it to at that point. You might be comparing a two-loss Clemson team that's an ACC champion to maybe a two-loss Georgia team that lost in the SEC title game. And so many different things to kind of weigh. Did Ohio State beat Wisconsin? What was the score with Miami? What was some of the other differentials that played out towards the end of the year? There's really no way to look at it, but I definitely think it's an interesting thing to talk about at this point.
All right, let's take a look now as these rankings do come out from Grapevine, Texas, the latest college football playoff top 25. We have 7 through 25 ready to go. We'll reveal this to you. We'll see it for the very first time. And how about those Gamecocks? Speaking of the Gamecocks, they do slide into the top 25 tonight by virtue of a win and also by virtue of the fact that Michigan, who did occupy that spot last week, does lose to Wisconsin. So the Gamecocks getting some love in the top 25, and I think for this week, that's absolutely justified for Will Muschamp's team.
I think it is too. They've been a team that it kind of been up and down, but think about it. They beat NC State in week 1. They've had some quality wins when you start to go down their schedule, and I think they're going to be a dangerous team. That's why we just talked about them. Talk about their their ability to possibly upset Clemson. Only a 14-point dog, and I think when you talk about a Clemson team that has struggled going on the road this year, this might be shaping up to be a little bit of a trap game.
Let's climb up these rankings a little more. We'll see the LSU Tigers on there as well, moving up a little bit. But it's Boise State at 23, Northwestern at 22, Stanford at 21, Memphis, one of the group of 5 teams, of course, led by Coach Mike Norvell, who may be an SEC coach at some time. He comes in at number 20. Oklahoma State, after the Kansas State loss, falls to 19. And then you see LSU, as we're predicting, moving up to 18 here. And I think that's the appropriate level of love to show for this LSU team, who has done a great job of kind of riding the ship here and putting the loss to Alabama beside them. That's obviously a game that a lot of LSU players really wanted in their final year there in Baton Rouge. Obviously putting the Troy loss behind them. And all of a sudden, Ed Orgeron, his first season as the full-time, full-season head coach, feels a lot more successful than you thought it might be back in really mid-September.
You got to give them credit for a crazy turnaround. When you talk about not only the loss to Troy, but the loss to Mississippi State for 30 points, it looked like a team that was disinterested. And you wondered how a guy like Ed Orgeron was going to get them back on track. We knew he had the ability to get a team pumped up. But give credit to not only him, but Matt Canada, Dave Aranda. They've gotten this team pointed in the right direction. And listen, they're not, there wasn't a dominant team this past week against Tennessee, but did the things they needed to do on the road in a crazy environment to be able to win that game. I think 18 is a great spot for them right now. I think if you talk to most LSU fans, they're pretty happy with it.
We'll look at the bottom part of the top 25 some more a little bit later on, but the top 6 is out now. Let's go ahead and take a look what the College Football Playoff Selection Committee decided to do here on this Tuesday night, setting the stage. And you do see a change there. How about that? A flip-flop at 2 and 3 between the undefeated Miami Hurricanes, the Clemson Tigers. No real impact in terms of what the ultimate playoff ranking is going to be, because these two teams will play each other. But Clemson, which got some love last week as the number 2 team, dropping down tonight. Miami undefeated by beating Virginia on Saturday, moving into number 2 here. Obviously, Wisconsin and Auburn just outside the top 4 at number 5 and number 6. But dive in, give me your thoughts. But the committee sort of favoring Miami here over Clemson.
I think it's interesting. Honestly, I wasn't sure that Miami wasn't going to take a step back after they struggled with a little bit with that Virginia team, having to score a late touchdown and kind of pull away from them. But I guess the committee looks at it and says, you know what? Clemson played Citadel last week, not really a Power 5 opponent, and Miami was able to beat an ACC opponent. I was kind of shocked when you see that pull up on the screen. I wasn't so sure that Miami wasn't going to fall back behind an Oklahoma team that really dealt a big loss to Kansas this past weekend.
I think this is a ludicrous made-for-TV stunt here. I mean, the idea that you're going to take two teams going to play each other, flip-flop them on the virtue of a Miami win that, as you said, was really not all that impressive. I mean, this for me is just theatrics, and I don't mind the drama because it obviously gives us something to talk about, but let's call this what this is. Yeah. This is coming off a week when very little happened in college football. We've got to be able to give something here. We've got to be able to give some sort of talking point. So how about we flip-flop Miami and Clemson, because there's really no punishment for being wrong here, because these two teams are going to play. But the truth is, I mean, you want to put Miami right now in a neutral field against Oklahoma. You think the turnover chain is going to do much against Baker Mayfield? I don't. You think a Clemson team that's been proven over the rigors of the last couple of seasons, you think that team flinches against Miami? I don't, which is obviously to say nothing of Alabama here as well. So you can put Miami at number 2 if you want to right now, but this is a made-for-TV talking point more so than it's sort of borne out by what's actually happening on the field.
Yeah, I think this is foolproof. If on the part of the committee, you line up and say, hey, listen, these two teams are going to have to play it on the field, so we can really do whatever we want to at this point. As long as they're both in the top 4 with their resumes right now, we know that they will face each other at some point. Both these teams 14-point favorites on the road this week, South Carolina and Pitt. So I think that obviously you take that into consideration when you're starting to put these rankings out. I think that's the most shocking thing to me. Obviously, it's the only change there when you look at the top 6. I don't know if it's deserving, but like I said, the committee's smart enough to know that, hey, this is not something we'll have to deal with once that final ranking gets here.
Stephen Tyler Peters says Wisconsin should be number 4, Oklahoma should be number 5, essentially, discrediting those rankings there a little bit. I mean, I think that one of the reasons why you see Wisconsin outside the top 5 right now is because the wins that Miami does have, this Notre Dame win, a pretty impressive shellacking that they put on Notre Dame. Virginia Tech, which doesn't currently show up in the rankings, that was also a convincing win for Miami, a team that was ranked at the time. So I think that's where this is coming in, the love for Miami in comparison to Wisconsin. I think it's based on some of those individual wins that Miami's collected, but the truth is a lot of the advanced metrics, a lot of that kind of stuff, they don't like Miami as much as this supposed eye test just seems to.
No, I agree with you. And listen, Miami still has an impressive win over Notre Dame, as much as a lot of people don't like that. When you look at Notre Dame's resume, that's still kind of what props up what Georgia and Miami have both done. That Notre Dame victory, and Notre Dame's still sitting there at number 8 after a win against Navy this weekend. Notre Dame is, by the way, Notre Dame's only a 2-point favorite against Stanford this weekend on the road. That might all come crashing down as well. But I look at it and I had to give it the eye test. And if Oklahoma and Wisconsin face off on the field, I'm taking Oklahoma every day of the week and twice on Sundays. I just think that's the way the game would play out. And the coaches that are on the committee, I think they see it the same way.
When you look at the teams in the top 6, what I think is kind of interesting here is compare Alabama and any of those teams. I believe the team that would give Alabama the most trouble out of that entire group of 6 there is the team that Alabama's playing on Saturday. Yeah. With all due respect to Oklahoma, which also has beaten Alabama in the past and has the kind of offense that Alabama doesn't love to play, there is something about Auburn because it combines a version of that offense with also a really, really feisty defense, that the toughest team from the 5 that Alabama could play is the one that plays on Saturday, I believe.
I agree with you. Listen, that's what's interesting about this Iron Bowl matchup is there's no secrets between these two coaching staffs. There's really not. Gus Malzahn and Nick Saban have faced off a ton of times, either as coordinator and head coach, or head coach and head coach. By the way, Kevin Steele, the defense coordinator for Auburn, he's been in Alabama too. Yeah, there's no secrets between these two coaching staffs, and I gotta agree with you. Right now, as far as the hottest teams go, Auburn is the one, and I think that's what makes it even more of an interesting matchup when they approach it this weekend.
I'm going to show you the rest of the top 25 in just a moment because we didn't get to reveal all of that because the top 6 came out. Before we do that, let me ask you one more question with the top 6 for right now. We obviously love this sport as fans. We also like what we do for a living here. And part of this as a fan or as a person that talks about this kind of stuff, it's about the drama. It's about the debate. It's about the conversation. When you look at this top 6 as it exists right now, are you worried that there is no drama, that there is no debate, that we legitimately have, and maybe this is a more fair way to do it, but when you look at this top 6, very easy to see SEC champion making the college football playoff. I believe Big Ten champion making the college football playoff. I believe ACC champion making the college football playoff, and Oklahoma running the table in this convoluted Big 12 title game scenario. It also makes the college football playoff that I essentially just gave you, not the 4 teams specifically, but the 4 paths in which that will be earned on the Path to Playoff presented by Academy Sports and Outdoors. Is that too little drama for you?
There's not too little drama because this is what sets it up for the drama. BA, when you think you know what's going to happen and you enter in rivalry week and all of a sudden Clemson's on the road against South Carolina, all of a sudden Alabama's on the road against Auburn, that's when the drama starts. It's not when you think you know what's going to happen. It's when when you're certain that you know how it's going to play out and it doesn't end up happening. I think that when you talk about ACC champion or SEC champion or Big Ten champion, we're not even sure if those guys are going to win this weekend, much less the next weekend when they face off against each other. I think that's what makes it so crazy. When you start to catch your breath here in a couple Saturdays and you look at it and go, man, I never in a million years expected that to happen. That happens every year in college football.
Gary Busby poking holes in Alabama at number 1, saying the Crimson Tide just slipped by Mississippi State. Georgia beat that team 31-3. Obviously, the problem for Georgia right now, though, is that loss to Auburn. That's why Georgia comes in below the top 6. And speaking of those teams coming in below the top 6, let's take a look at those right now, the rest of those college football rankings. We talked about a couple of SEC teams jumping in here before at South Carolina. Maybe a slight surprise at 24. LSU at number 18. Let's climb our way up to the top. Washington at 17. Michigan State at 16. Group of 5 UCF stays there at number 15. They've got a New Year's Six Bowl awaiting for them. Mississippi State goes to 14 here right now. Washington State at 13. TCU at 12, USC at 11, Penn State at 10, Ohio State 9, Notre Dame 8. I thought the committee might play a game with the Buckeyes and the Irish. That doesn't happen. Georgia at number 7. What jumps out at you about those rankings there?
Well, I think when you look at it, we've talked all time, all season really about the committee, and they're not supposed to look at margin of victory. This is the first week I feel like we've really paid attention to that. You look at Mississippi State climbing a couple spots. You look at LSU. You look at some of the teams that did fall. You look at the switch from Miami and Clemson. They did not look at margin of victory this week. They really looked at it and said, who beat a conference opponent? Mississippi State beating Arkansas. Miami beating Virginia. Who beat a conference opponent and who didn't? Who played a weak opponent this past weekend? I think that's the first time we can really look at it and say that for a fact that that's how they probably felt.
Let me remind you, that's Mike Johnson. My name is Brandon Adams. This is Path to the Playoff, presented by Academy Sports and Outdoors. Academy Sports and Outdoors. 4 all, 4 less. We'll continue to talk about everything the College Football Playoff Selection Committee did tonight with its top 25 rankings and how that sets us up for the final weekend of the regular season. So please make sure you continue to get your comments in. And don't forget, you can get more coverage of your team at SECCountry.com over the course of the days ahead. So Christy Hardy in the comment section brings up an interesting point, and it's reflective of what we're seeing a lot, that Auburn's going to beat Alabama so bad, and she has her own colorful way of saying that. It is kind of funny, and I want to talk about the Iron Bowl here for a moment, but it's kind of funny how many people in the comment section seem to be picking Auburn over Alabama, and obviously I know that these are Auburn fans. I do get that, but we're hearing a lot more confidence from Auburn fans right now in our Path to the Playoff, presented by Academy Sports and Outdoors comment section, than we're hearing from Alabama fans. And yet the Vegas point spread would tell you a different story here. Alabama going on the road, the Open is a 5-point favorite here this week. Given what we've seen from Auburn lately, given the injury situation that Alabama is dealing with, is the wrong team favored in Jordan-Hare Stadium on Saturday?
I think you make that argument. Obviously when you look at Auburn's resume, I think what really pokes holes in them is what were they doing second half against LSU, and why was their offense so abysmal when they faced off against Clemson? Alabama's probably been the more consistent team, but the ceiling is higher for Auburn, and I think that's what a lot of people point to. The Auburn fans, listen, I had an Auburn fan today tell me that Auburn's going to win by 40. Alabama hasn't lost a game in 14 years by more than 17, and Auburn's going to win by 40 this weekend. But the path is there for it to happen. If Jarrett Stidham plays his game and Gus Malzahn calls a good game and they play at the top of their level like they did a couple of weeks ago against Georgia, then they could very easily win this game. But it has to be played out on the field. Bama has been consistent enough and has beaten everybody on their schedule so far this year. So, listen, I think you have to go somewhere between reality and perception, and I think right now that's what these bookies are doing that are making these lines.
Yeah, I do get that. Alabama obviously has the perception earned out over the course of years here. Totally appreciate that. But I can't move off of, when I've seen Alabama struggle in the Nick Saban era, it's been against Deshaun Watson. It's been against Johnny Manziel. It's been against quarterbacks like that, Cam Newton in 2010. And Jarrett Stidham, the Auburn quarterback, is not the perfect embodiment of that. But when you think about what Saban's had trouble with, it is a quarterback like Stidham. Yeah. It's one of the reasons why, going back to the offseason, I thought this was a good spot for Auburn. Now, Auburn almost lost too much getting ready for this, but I do think that they are potentially the kind of team that Nick Saban doesn't want to play.
I agree with you. I don't even look at the quarterbacks you just said, the dual threat guys. I look at, Stephen Garcia at South Carolina in 2010. I also look at Trevor Knight from Oklahoma that was able to beat them down in the Sugar Bowl. That, to me, is more Jarrett Jarrett Stidham like? A guy that can put a ball on the dime and can run out and throw from all angles with their arms. I brought that up a bunch this week. A guy who can throw from up here down the field and also sling it sidearm and can roll out and make all these crazy throws on all these different angles. That's what Jarrett Stidham does. I think that's what drives Nick Saban and company crazy. They have a huge task ahead of them this week.
And can I squeeze in one more point, kind of slightly off the subject when it comes to the Iron Bowl? You know, I'm hearing all this stuff out there that Baker Mayfield's such a big Heisman favorite that they're even taking the betting lines off the Vegas sports books. The winner of this Iron Bowl game, whether it be Hurts on the Alabama side, Stidham or Kerryon Johnson on the Auburn side, can we put the winner of this in the Heisman conversation a little bit?
I think that's definitely a conversation you can have, especially when you look at some of the numbers. I mean, Kerryon Johnson's leading the SEC. His numbers aren't huge when you look at past SEC rushing leaders, but he'll be up over the 1,200-yard mark this weekend, and there's something to be said about leading the SEC in rushing. And you look at Jalen Hurts, almost 2,000 yards. He might get to 1,000 yards rushing this year, depending on how many more games they play in. He's been an incredible player for them. So if nothing else, I think either one of those guys, depending on who wins this weekend, definitely deserves a trip to New York.
A lot of Georgia fans weighing in on the comment section. They want to find out how Georgia's set up for its path to the playoff. We'll talk about that coming up in just a moment. Before we get to that, though, let me squeeze in one more thought on the Iron Bowl here. That is, we know what's at stake here for Auburn. A loss here essentially ends the Auburn season. No way forward for Auburn if it drops to 9-3 and doesn't go to the SEC championship game. But how about Alabama here? You know, I just gave you the absence of drama. You know, the winner of the SEC, Big Ten, ACC, along with Oklahoma making the playoff. What if Alabama stubs its toe here? Is Alabama still lurking as a team that could be in the playoff as a second SEC team? Does the loss end that? How do you feel about Alabama somehow sneaking in the back door of the playoff if it loses on Saturday?
I think you have to look at this weekend's schedule. Not so much about what's going to happen in championship weekend, but I think you have to look at this weekend's schedule and hope that somebody else stubs their toe. You know, is it going to be Miami playing Pitt or Clemson playing South Carolina or one of these other rivalry games the way they match up? Are you going to see Oklahoma stub its toe against West Virginia? Something like that, in my opinion, has to happen if we're going to see Alabama kind of backdoor this college football playoff thing. But crazier things have happened. You know, Alabama sitting there at 11-1 has a pretty good resume on their hands when you talk about comparing this to two lost teams. But I think a lot of things have to play out. I give it like a 20% chance.
Here's the weird thing here. You know, the human voters, the committee has been telling us all season long that Alabama's better than Wisconsin and Miami. And yet it would be weird to think that Wisconsin or Miami could be picked over Alabama because the Crimson Tide lost to Team Auburn that's better than really anybody that Miami or Wisconsin's played all season long.
Yeah, it's definitely something to look at, too. And obviously we've talked about what the strength of schedule is for either one of these teams. Florida State's not what you thought it was when Alabama opened against them, you know, the greatest opener of all time, and they're in week 1. But I think you've got to give them the edge based on just margin of victory. You know, Wisconsin's been winning games by 7 points, 10 points. Bama's been beating, you know, conference opponents by 55, 60 points sometimes. When you look at, Vanderbilt, Tennessee, Ole Miss, they've really been running away from the game. It's not so much the schedule, the strength of schedule and who's played who, but it's about the margin of victory when you look at Alabama. They're so efficient right now.
All right, let me shift gears here. You know, a lot of Georgia fans have been talking to us all night. Georgia does come in at number 7, the same spot it occupied a week ago. Does beat Kentucky on Saturday, and blowout fashion, and using really the similar formula that Georgia's used all season long. Mostly the ground game, pretty good defensive effort, very little from the passing game, but it was back to the Georgia that was in play before the Auburn game. How much did Georgia's dominant blowout win over Kentucky, a team that may be better than you realize, how much did that cause you to forget what plagued Georgia during the Auburn game, or is that failure in Jordan-Hare Stadium still on your mind when you think about the Dogs?
I think it eases it a little bit, but I don't think you forget about what happened when you were the number 1 team in the country and go on the road to play one of your rivalry games. I think, if anything, this is a notch up for me for Kirby Smart. I think that when you look at Kirby Smart, and the biggest thing for me is don't show me what you can do as a head coach when the world is watching. Show me what you can do when your back's against the wall and you've been upset and your players are embarrassed and you have to play a Kentucky team that is outgunned. Show me that you can go in there and deal with business and win by 30 points. And that's exactly what Georgia did this weekend. They did it the way they've been playing all year. Stopping the run game, wreaking havoc up front in the front 7, and being able to efficiently run on schedule. That was a great game for Georgia. I'm not going to forget about the Auburn loss. I don't think anybody is just yet. But you know what? They're going to get their chance to overshadow that here in a couple of weeks.
Christopher White, Blair Dietz both talking about wanting a rematch against Auburn. Chris Kelly says that Georgia can't beat a team that has a good rushing defense. And what the criticism of Georgia speaks to there is, I think for a lot of Georgia fans, the frustrating nature of a game against Kentucky. You know, Georgia wants to prove it's better than it showed against Auburn, but you really can't prove that against Kentucky. Yeah. And to a certain extent, you can't even prove that to close out the regular season against Georgia Tech. You can only prove that either against Auburn again or Alabama in the the SEC championship game, and you can't play that game this Saturday if you're Georgia or last Saturday. There is a bit of a waiting game here where a lot of folks in our comment section are going to take some pot shots at Georgia, and probably with good reason based on the egg it laid in Jordan-Hare Stadium last Saturday.
And Georgia is now entering the realm of college football playoff rankings where all of a sudden the eyes are all on you in top 10, and it's not so much about who you beat and when, it's about how bad you beat them. And nothing good really could have come from this Kentucky game for Georgia. Either you go out and beat them by 30, and you should have done that, or you don't play a very good game and you don't beat them handily, and all of a sudden there's even more questions about Georgia. So, like I said, I think if nothing else, this game gives you a notch on Kirby Smart's belt, and you say, man, he really is a good coach. He got his team prepared. But when you look at the rankings, when you look at how the committee's going to look at it, there's really nothing good that could have come from this past weekend.
It's Academy Sports and Outdoors path to the playoff. Academy Sports and Outdoors, 4 all, 4 less. Let me talk to you a little bit here about some of those other SEC teams that we just discussed a moment ago. You know, South Carolina jumps into the poll at number 23 this week. LSU climbing from number 20 where it was last week. Mississippi State, nice solid number 14 ranking after the win against Arkansas on Saturday. These 3 teams, while not really in the discussion for a playoff berth, still have a lot to be determined in terms of a bowl invitation here. When you think about it, I think both South Carolina, Mississippi State, LSU, I think Orlando is a landing spot that one of these teams could potentially enjoy. I think if you're LSU, you think about the Texas Bowl, maybe going out and facing one of those good Big 12 teams. But let's not forget, as these teams go into the final game of the regular season, a rivalry game for Mississippi State against Ole Miss, a rivalry game for South Carolina against Clemson, and obviously for LSU, a game against Texas A&M. There is still something to be played there because you're talking about a much more attractive bowl slot in that kind of, traditional New Year's time slot during the day where the country can watch it. And for LSU to think that it could be back in a big-time bowl after really just a few weeks ago, we wondered if they would even be going to any kind of postseason destination. That's still something for LSU to play for here.
I completely agree with you. When you talk about the Texas Bowl, and listen, I feel the same way about South Carolina and Mississippi State. You're possibly looking at maybe an Outback Bowl if you're Mississippi State. South Carolina, possibly traveling to Orlando, getting in that Citrus Bowl down there. I think those are great destinations for those teams. So they're destinations that these teams haven't been in a while, and so I think you'd see a lot of fan interest when you look at this. There's good programs that are definitely, I think all 3 of those programs right now are on the rise. I don't think anybody wants to play any 3 of them.
And listen, if you watch me during the week here on the SEC Country Facebook page, you know that recruiting really matters to me, and I'm a big believer that you want future recruits to come to your program. Give yourself a nice showcase at the end of the season in a really attractive bowl game, a lot of sunshine, a lot of pretty girls in the stands. That's what these teams are still playing for here.
I agree with you. I think you can see one of those Big Ten matchups, possibly like a Michigan State facing off against Mississippi State. What a great game that would be for Mississippi State. South Carolina, wouldn't be shocked to see them maybe like a lineup with Louisville or another good ACC team. There's a lot to be played out. I think those are sexy matchups. When you're on the recruiting trail and you can point to that as a head coach and say, hey, man, we're facing off against Lamar Jackson. We're facing off against this team. A lot of good things to look to when you're one of the members of these fan bases and recruiting rankings continue to rise.
Okay, that's for later on, though. Now let's deal with some of what's going to be going on this week. And I really believe that one of the themes for this weekend, like it is for a lot of rivalry weekends, is be careful if you're the big favorite in the game that you're playing on Saturday. Let me show you some of the games that I'm talking about here. We dealt with the South Carolina Clemson game a little early in the show. We'll talk some more about that. But how about Miami at Pitt at noon on Friday, noon Eastern time? This is a game that's got major playoff ramifications, and I've been told, and I'm no weatherman, but I've been told there's a chance of some bad weather there in the Heinz Field in Pittsburgh. How about some snow to impact the path to the playoff? That could be what's at stake for Miami and Pitt on Friday.
I'm telling you right now, this is one of those games that gets scary if you're a Miami fan. I know that you rolled over Notre Dame, you've done some good things, you played a Virginia team tough this past weekend. When you look at that weather, a lot of that Miami team is from South Florida, not used to getting snowy conditions. Probably a lot of them never even played in snow. Possibly none of them ever even seen snow. When you talk about some of the kids that are on that team, going into that environment, and Pitt, you've seen Heinz Field up in Pittsburgh, it is going to be raucous. I think that's one to be careful for. We've already seen Clemson and another handful of teams, Washington, USC, go down on Friday. These Friday games are scary. Even after Thanksgiving, I think you have to be careful if you're Miami.
Georgia's playing Georgia Tech, also at noon Eastern time. Georgia Tech, a team that beat Georgia a year ago. Obviously, Georgia at number 7 in this week's rankings, got everything to play for. If you're Georgia, is there an upset watch for you here in Atlanta?
I think there should be. Georgia's going to be an 11-point favorite. Anytime you play the triple option offense, you never know what to expect. You know how it is, and you've seen it, you've seen it play out. When Georgia lines up on the field against Georgia Tech, you're not sure what's going to happen. Anytime these cut blocks and triple options come in there, it's all about preparation. I know Kirby Smart probably learned something last year from facing off against Paul Johnson. Obviously, the front seven for Georgia's played a ton better this year, but I think they have to be careful. When you line up in that game and rivalry games and crazy things happen, Georgia cannot afford to have a letdown this weekend.
We've talked a lot about the Iron Bowl, obviously, already in today's show. I also talked to you a little earlier about South Carolina Clemson. You and I both think the Gamecocks could keep it close against the Tigers on Saturday. So let me squeeze in one more game. Mention the Ohio State-Michigan game. Michigan did not look good last week against Wisconsin. Jim Harbaugh has really received a lot of criticism this week. Do you think Michigan could keep it close against Ohio State on Saturday?
I definitely do. This one kind of goes in the category for me for Georgia Tech, Georgia. You talk about those 11.5 point spreads. To me, that says, you know what? Even though one team is clearly better than the other one, we're not comfortable saying either one of these games are going to be blowouts. You keep it right there in the double digits. To me, you could see a Michigan team that gets their quarterback this week off concussion protocol, maybe make some plays on the offense. It has been getting a little bit better over the past few weeks. Maybe they make a play that kind of keeps the game close late. Jim Harbaugh has shown the ability to coach up this team to play Urban Meyer and Ohio State close.
Let's come back to the SEC to finish off our discussion for tonight. Obviously, the Iron Bowl, the big one in this league on Saturday between Alabama and Auburn. The winner of that game goes to the college football, really one of the games that's been the centerpiece of the sport for a number of years, the SEC Championship. For the first time this year, the brand new Mercedes-Benz Stadium in Atlanta. Now from the SEC East, Georgia's already punched its ticket into that game. So is there a preference here if you're a Georgia fan? An Auburn team that you could both get revenge against, but also a team that you've seen, or Alabama, which is undefeated, but maybe a little banged up with injury. If you're a Georgia fan or a Georgia coach or player, is there one preference you'd have in terms of who you see come out of the Iron Bowl?
I'm not sure. I think that's for Georgia fans to answer. I think that when you just got done with the game and you just gotten whooped by Auburn, and it was kind of a lopsided victory, especially in the second half, and Alabama was kind of struggling with Mississippi State. I think you point at Alabama and say, man, we'd really like them. But once that kind of wears off and you start to look at it, things start to even out. I think that if I'm a Georgia fan, I'm just glad that I'm not playing in that Iron Bowl this weekend. Let's deal with Georgia Tech. Let's stay healthy, and let's see how those two games play out on the other side of the conference, and we'll get a ton more film on either one of these games. If neither one of these teams are unbeatable, in my opinion, I don't know that Alabama or Auburn are world beaters, and so I just think Georgia's lucky to be able to kind of watch from the outside on that game.
I had a Georgia fan tell me this week that his only preference in the Iron Bowl is that it goes long, multiple overtimes. It's very, very physical. And if he gets that, he said he doesn't care who wins the game as long as both these teams have to put out a lot against each other on Saturday. And I think there's probably a lot of dog fans that feel that way.
I definitely do too. I mean, the biggest thing for Georgia right now, and they're going to play that triple option offense, stay healthy. You keep these these cut blocks off your front seven, your defense. Make sure everybody comes out of that game healthy. I think that's the most important thing this weekend.
I think a great final thought here for our discussion comes from Jeff Starling, who says there's nothing better than Thanksgiving leftovers in rivalry week. Can I get an amen? Jeff, that is so well said and such a great thought to think that all day on Thursday, by the way, the Egg Bowl Thursday night, not a playoff implication game, but a terrific rivalry in the SEC. Then you wake up on Friday, you got those games, eat those leftovers, roll on into Saturday. I know you're looking forward to it. I am as well, both for the games of the teams that we care about the most and all the other games around the SEC. It's going to be a fantastic weekend.
I'm an offensive lineman at heart. This is our holiday, man. Yeah. Give me some turkey and give me some football. This is it.
So let me take a moment to say thanks so much for being with us tonight on Path to Playoff, presented by Academy Sports and Outdoors. Academy Sports and Outdoors, for all, for less. That's the former Alabama All-American Mike Johnson. My name is Brandon Adams. You can catch us out throughout the week on SEC Country Facebook page. Hope you'll join us for those shows and for coverage of your team. Whether it's on the Path to Playoff or not, make sure you continue to check out SECCountry.com as well. We'll see you again here next week for another episode of Path to the Playoff, presented by Academy Sports and Outdoors.